Father, we are truly grateful for your love and your mercy to us. The fact that you have called us to be your children, and you have revealed yourself to us. We could have not known you unless you had spoken to our hearts. And we thank you for that, and we thank you for providing for us for each moment of the day. Give us the strength that we need, the wisdom and understanding to understand your word, and then the ability to put it into practice in our own lives, that we will be hearers of the word and not just the ability to hear, but to do as well, so that we will not forget what we have read, but that we will be able to grow in you. Lord, we thank you for this class and for the opportunity of fellowship together. We ask your guidance upon us in Christ's name. Amen. We are into the writings, which is that third section of the Old Testament, and we've dealt with the books of Psalms and Job, Proverbs. Now we come to one that is not nearly as well known, and that is Ecclesiastes or Kohelet. What normally is thought about Ecclesiastes is that he says everything is meaningless. And many people believe that. But that really isn't what he is trying to tell us. Ecclesiastes is a person who is looking at what normally is considered orthodox theology, and he is challenging this. The same way in which Job is a challenge to orthodox theology, Ecclesiastes is a challenge. It usually is associated with Solomon, and it may be for that reason that it gained entry into the canon. But it really has nothing to do with him. The date on it is sometime between 400 and 200 BC, so it would be at least 500 years after the time of Solomon. The author is a wise person who is challenging the opinions of others. And his conclusion is that we need to use what God has given us in moderation and enjoy it. This is not what the traditional view was. The traditional view is if you work hard and you keep the law, God will bless you. And if you do not work hard, then you will disappear. Well, this person tells us that there are some who work hard, very hard, and all they have as a result of this is the knowledge that somebody else is going to benefit from their work. They don't benefit from it themselves. So that's not an indication then that we should put too much emphasis upon work. The chapter in the textbook is extremely well done, I think, for the book of Ecclesiastes. And what I'd like to do is just to emphasize some of the points that they make. At first is the theme, the freedom of God and the mystery of His ways. God is sovereign. God can do anything that He wishes. Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes, attacks false confidence. Now, he takes 12 chapters to show us how he reached his conclusion, And that's basically what he is doing. There's a lot of material in there that Kohelet himself does not believe. And he quotes it, and then he refutes it. And you have two arguments that are going on most of the time. And his conclusion is that if you put too much emphasis in any direction, it's bad. If you work too hard, that's bad. If you play too hard, that's bad. If you eat too much, that's bad. If you sleep too much, that's bad. See, so all of these things are not good, carried to extreme. The positive side that we receive from Kohelet is that we should enjoy the simple things of life as God gives them. And his statement on that you'll find in chapter 2, verse 24. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And also in chapter 12, verse 13, we have basically this same conclusion. This is at the end of the book. Now all has been said. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Amen. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. And one comment on this, fear God and keep his commandments. The commandments he's talking about are those commandments that Kohelet himself has given us within the book. It is not talking about the 10 Commandments or the commandments of Moses, but the commandments that he has laid down for us. There are several... Yes?
I was going to say, you agree with this to obey his orders. Stand in awe of God.
Now, there are several literary characteristics that we see in Kohelet, and these are excellent styles. This person who wrote this really knew what he was doing. As it's fascinating just to go through and see the turn of phrase that he has, or the type of literary style he uses, a rhetorical question, or a proverb, an allegory. All of these are incorporated into the book. Now, basically, the reflections are observations that he makes on life. And the Proverbs also is a reflection on life. Kohelet uses both Proverbs, which are simple statements, and he uses admonitions, which are commands that he gives us. A proverb is where you merely observe and pass judgment on what you see. A command is where he tells us to do something. The rhetorical questions are found throughout the book. Now, the first one is in chapter 1, verse 3. What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Now, that's a rhetorical question. He isn't asking that you answer that. He's asking it so that he can go ahead and answer it. So that is a rhetorical question. And his work is just full of these rhetorical questions. He also uses anti-proverbs. This is where you state a proverb opposite to what a person normally expects. And this is extremely useful because it arrests the attention of the person and makes them think. An example of this is in chapter 1, verse 18. We already looked at the book of Proverbs, where Proverbs is telling us that we should follow after wisdom, we should get wisdom, and if we have wisdom, then everything will go right. Well, here in Ecclesiastes, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Well, in my own experience, it's because you don't have the answers. I had a lot more answers 30 years ago than I do today. And I found that this is true, that the more you know, the more grief there is. This is one of the reasons I cannot play a Bible trivia game. As they'll ask the question, and there is no simple answer to the question, many times. Or the answer that they expect is wrong. So if you don't know very much, you can play it with fun. But I find it very distressing when I play with a Bible trivia. And I think that you found that too. That there are times when you have held an opinion, and then you found out that, well, perhaps that opinion is not right, and you need to correct that on the basis of additional information, and then it throws your whole life into a different quandary. And you've got to rethink a lot of issues rather than just one. And so this is true, but it's not what conventional wisdom would have us believe. Wisdom in Proverbs, follow after wisdom, because that's the end of all things. And here it says, no, with wisdom comes sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. There is an allegory in the book of Proverbs, or in the book of Ecclesiastes, that I enjoy very much. And that's in the final chapter, chapter 12, which begins with, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Unfortunately, that was translated in the King James as, now remember your Creator. And I have heard a lot of sermons, especially directed to youth, with the emphasis upon now. There's no now in the text. It just happens to be the way in which it was started in the King James translation, where we use the phrase, now remember. Not now, remember. It's like, well, remember. It's that emphasis, but a lot of sermons have been wasted on now. And the admonition is to remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years approach, when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Now the allegory follows, and the allegory is a description of growing old. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark, talking about the vitality of an individual, and the clouds return after the rain. When the keepers of the house tremble, those are your arms. And the strong men stoop. That's the back. When the grinders cease, because they are few, the teeth. And those looking through the windows grow dim, the eyes. When the doors to the street are closed and the sound of grinding fades, that's the ears. When men rise up at the sound of birds, the inability to sleep. But all their songs grow faint, and it's the strength of the voice subsides. When men are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets, and they're afraid of heights because you may get off balance and fall. Dangers in the streets, these are usually not real, but imagined. When the almond tree blossoms, that's gray hair. And the grasshopper drags himself along, that's the crippling frailty that comes. And desire no longer is stirred. Then man goes to his eternal home, and mourners go about the streets. Now, we are going through this with my mother-in-law. She is 92 now, and about 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago, she fell in her apartment. And since that time, she has been in the nursing center at the University Village. And here, I guess about a week and a half ago, my wife took her over to the dining room, which is in the West Wing, to see if she would like to move into that area and have additional care over in that wing. Well, she was sitting there and looking around, and then she was, "Oh, I don't want to be here. Look at all those old people." She points over to some fellow that's lying there asleep with his mouth open. And then she points over to a woman, and my wife, "Now, don't point. She's 92, probably the oldest one there. And she was in her room the other day, and my wife was trying on some socks. And I was outside, and a woman a couple of doors down was being taken for her back. And first thing I hear is, "Don't touch me, don't touch me." And then she comes out in her stroller with the nurse walking beside her. And she passes the room where my mother-in-law lives. And she says, "Why don't they let all those old people move in? I've been here for years, and I don't like these old people coming in." Here again, she's as old as anybody. And I guess we all have the idea that other people grow old, and we don't. But here is tells what really is happening. And in mother-in-law's case, this is having effect. She can't chew nearly as well as she used to, so when we serve her meat, we grind it up so she can chew it. She hears well, and she sees well, so you have to be careful. But she can't move like she used to. Took her to her apartment yesterday, and she has trouble with the carpet. It's too thick, so she can't move with the carpet. So we're going to have to replace that with a carpet to make it easier for her to get around. And then see if she can take care of herself within that situation. And we don't know if she'll be able to or not, but we want to give her the chance to get out of the nursing center and back into an apartment. But this certainly fits in that situation. And then verses 6 and 7, which is a beautiful picture. It uses these figures of speech. Remember him, saying the same thing that the first part of the chapter said. Remember him before the silver cord is severed or the golden bowl is broken. You know, all those are figures for death. Before the pitcher is shattered at the spring or the wheel broken at the well. And the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. So those are figures of speech which are used to say the same thing basically as the first part. That has to do with old age.
In this particular scripture, evidently Solomon didn't believe in the resurrection of God.
Well, whoever wrote this probably was not Solomon. And whoever says, no, he is not thinking in terms of resurrection. We may have a few places in the Old Testament where resurrection is hinted at. We had one of our students who did a study on the resurrection and concluded that there are some places in the Psalms and perhaps in Job where the resurrection is indicated. But no, this does not. Finish it out and move on. So enjoy what you can while you can. Now the in the contribution of Ecclesiastes to theology, there are 2 points that the book makes, and I think these are extremely important. One is that people are limited by the way in which God has determined the events of their life. We are born in a particular place at a particular time, and we have no control over that. All we can do is experience what we ourselves have come into contact with. We do not experience what other people have experienced. But we are limited in what we know because of these circumstances. And the second point is that the human creatures are limited by their inability to discover God's ways. Unless God reveals Himself to us, there's no way that we can find out about Him. Now, there are arguments that are used in philosophy to try to prove the existence of God, but those are merely exercises in futility. Now, there is no way that you can prove to someone who doesn't believe in God that there is a God. The only thing that can happen is for them to have an experience with God, God revealing Himself to them, and then they know it. But if God does not reveal Himself, there's no way for man to find out about that. There's also, in the section where he talks about facing life's realities, he speaks about grace and death and enjoyment. In that section on death, a comment has to do with the fact of death is sure, but the timing is not. Often we hear the argument that we need to do something about the sicknesses, the diseases that we have, because so many people are killed each year by those sicknesses. Well, that's true, but it isn't a necessity to try to do something about them to keep them from dying. They're going to die anyway. What we are anxious about is them dying prematurely, because everybody's going to die. So the book of Ecclesiastes is emphasizing the untimely death. And that really is our concern too, is the untimely death. Not the fact that a person dies, because eventually they will. It's inevitable, unless we have the rapture. Then we'll be changed, and we won't have to worry. The conclusion of the chapter also has some interesting comments where he, I don't know which one wrote this material on Ecclesiastes, I would guess that it would be Hubbard. It shows that some of the problems that we face, the difficulties, the unanswered questions, points the way to New Testament study, where in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we have some questions that are problems. Why is it that Christ had to die? What about the resurrection? What does that do for us? These are questions that have to be answered. The reality of suffering, the reality of death, but then also the resurrection of Christ and the effect that has on us. The book of Ecclesiastes prepares the way for the questions concerning those matters. I wish we had time to go through the whole book, but unfortunately we don't. There is a passage that you may want to become familiar with if you have not already, and that's in chapter 3, there is a time for everything, you may be able to use that. I remember at Huntington College, this has been about 26, 27 years ago, we had a hayride, and after the hayride, I was supposed to give a devotional. But when you're dealing with students on a hayride, you have all kinds of circumstances, and after they've had all of this fun, then you're supposed to quiet them down for a devotional. Well, I use this passage. So easy transition. There's a time for everything. There's a time to have fun. There's a time to be serious. So this sort of thing will work for you there. Notice that there is a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away. All kinds of opposites we have here in chapter 3. Yes. Mm-hmm. It's general. It's a general statement. There are times when it's necessary to kill, and you should kill. It could be an animal. It could be a person. Warfare. But on the other hand, there's a time to heal. So it's just general statements, nothing specific that they're talking about. All right, let's turn over to the Song of Songs. And do we have anybody in here that's under 25 years of age? You aren't supposed to read this. Perhaps we ought to have you step out while we discuss this. The Song of Songs is supposed to be denied to the young Jewish boy until he has reached the age of 25. I guess there's just too much suggestive material in the book. There are several attempts to try to make the Song of Songs relevant and to answer the question, why is it in the Scripture? It's generally treated allegorically. The love of Christ for His church. Well, the book doesn't say anything about the love of Christ for His church. It speaks about the love of a man and a woman. And basically that's it. Now the book gives several suggested interpretations. Allegorical, typical, and when you say it talks about Christ and the church, you're treating it typically. Allegorically is where you really make it say something other than what it looks like on the surface. There is the dramatic, and this is usually when the man is said to be Solomon, and the girl is the Shunammite, and she has a lover back home, a third party, saying that she's really in love with him. So you have three. Nowhere in the book does it mention the third party. Yes, brother. That's right. The Rose of Sharon, the Lily of the Valleys. Yes. That's where it comes. And in this case, it's the man who's saying this. In the NIV translation, in the margin, you have beloved, friends, and lover, who are put so that you get some idea of who's doing the talking. Now, that's not in the original text. That's an additional item. That's why it's in italics. And it does make it a little easier to understand the book. What I think the book is, it's the love of a man for a woman. That's it. And I think that there is a good, positive reason for it being in the Scripture. It is part of life. And it is expressing the love that should be present in the marriage situation. So I find it an excellent love song. I keep forgetting this. Somebody gave me a drawing somebody has done using the description in the book of the Beloved. And well done. The description you'll see in chapter 4, where he describes her. How beautiful you are, my darling, oh how beautiful. Your eyes behind your veil are doves. Now that's metaphor, where you use one thing to express another. And in this drawing, the eyes are two little doves that are looking out at the place for the eye sockets. Your hair is like a flock of goats descending from Mount Gilead. So the hair is made up of a lot of little goats coming. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep just shorn, coming up from the washing. Each has its twin, not one of them is alone. Your lips are like a scarlet ribbon. Your mouth is lovely. And so the lips are in the form of a ribbon. And it's not too drastic a picture, but it does look a little peculiar with all of these things in it. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with elegance. And so there is a stone neck built like a tower. But see, all of this is metaphor, where you're taking things that are depicting beauty and reflecting the woman in the light of that. So it's not derogatory in any way, the way in which it is presented. It's just when we try to do it literally, then it destroys the imagery. We won't have time either to go through the Song of Songs. I had one woman in the class last year who said that she was wanting to get me to tell her husband that he should read it. Perhaps he would be a little bit more tender and loving. And this might be a good idea for some of you fellows to read the Song of Songs. Now we have several of these books that are small books that are all put in one group that are called the Megillot, or the scrolls. And the book of Ruth, Esther, Lamentations are a part of that. Ecclesiastes also and Song of Songs make up the Megillot. They are read on particular occasions. I forget now when Ecclesiastes is read at Tabernacles, the Feast of Tabernacles, and Song of Songs at Passover. And then Ruth is at Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, which marks the end of the harvest season. Because in the book of Ruth, there is quite a bit said about the harvest. And Ruth has gone out to glean in the harvest fields. The book of Ruth is written for two purposes. One is to stress levirate marriage, and the other is the ancestry of David. It probably was written in the time of David, when he was king. You have the book of Judges that constantly repeats a theme. There was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes, indicating there was chaos because there was no king. Then you have a king that came along, and that was Saul, but Saul was not a good king. Now, when David came to the throne, then he becomes the standard for all of the others. And the book of Ruth shows the ancestry of David, as opposed to the ancestry of Saul, which is in the final chapter of the book of Judges, the tribe of Benjamin that is almost wiped out, and the women who are brought from Jabesh Gilead to become the wives of those men who survived. Levirate, Levirate. It's a Latin word which means brother-in-law. This is the occasion where Naomi and her husband Elimelech and her two sons went from the region of Bethlehem to Moab because there was a famine in the area of Judah. While they are in Moab, Chilion and Mahlon, the two sons, die, and Elimelech, her husband, also dies. And she's left with two daughters-in-law. She has an obligation to provide them husbands, but she doesn't have any more sons. Now, if only one of the sons had died, either Chilion or Mahlon, then the two women would have been his wives. He would have a responsibility to raise up children to the deceased brother. Well, in the case where both of them are dead, then it is Naomi's responsibility to provide husbands for them. And she explains to them that this is not possible, that she herself is old, and even if she were to marry that night and have children, the girls couldn't wait until the boys grew up. So she wants them to go home. One of them does, but Ruth decides that she is going to go back to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law. And after they arrive in Bethlehem, then it is discovered that Boaz is the next of kin. And Boaz performs the obligation of the next of kin, the levirate. So the book of Ruth is in there for that particular reason. The book of Lamentations is read on the 9th of Av. That's when there is the celebration of the destruction of the temple in 586, and also the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. There's thought that the temple was destroyed on the same day, both times. And on the 9th of Av is when they celebrate that, and the book of Lamentations is read. In our Bibles, Lamentations is put with Jeremiah, because Jeremiah is thought to be the author. It doesn't say that he is in the book itself, but in the book of Jeremiah, it mentions that Jeremiah did write some Lamentations. The poetic style of Lamentations is what is called acrostic. The first verse begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the second begins with the second letter, and so on. So that in the books of the 5 chapters of Lamentations, you have at least 4 of them that are in this acrostic style. And if each verse is written with one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, then you should have 22 verses in that lamentation. And in the first chapter, you have 22 verses, because there are 22 letters. In the second chapter, you have the same thing. There are 22 letters. The third chapter, you have 3 verses that begin with the first letter, then 3 verses that begin with the second letter. So you should end up with 66 verses in the third chapter. Chapter 4 also is acrostic, but chapter 5 is not. Of interest to those who know Hebrew would be the order of these letters. For instance, in chapter 3, we have verse 43, 45, 44, and 45 with Psalmic. And then 46, 47, 48 has pay. And 49, 50, 51 has ayin. Now, if you have learned your Hebrew alphabet, see that they're out of order. It's usually Psalmic, ayin, and pay, and then sadi. This has Psalmic, pay, ayin, and sadi. And the argument was for a long time, these are out of order, and what we need to do is to reverse them. About 10 years ago, there was a tablet found in Israel, and this tablet had an alphabet scratched on it. It dates back to the time of the Judges, which would be about 1200 BC. And that order of the alphabet is the order that we have in Lamentations. Instead of ayin pay, it's pay ayin. So there's no need to change it at all. It indicates that at that time, the order of the God, much more so than in the books of Samuel and Kings. Now we do see some, like Samuel, when he is acting as judge, God intervenes, he sends thunder and defeats the Philistines. We have a number of times when God intervenes. But in the book of Chronicles, we see more of this. One would be when Jehoshaphat is attacked by people from across the Dead Sea. He is told, don't do anything. Just go out and wait and watch God work for you. And this is what he did. He didn't have to fight at all. God intervened. The armies began fighting among themselves and killed one another off. And all the Judahites had to do was to collect the booty and bury the dead. There is an emphasis upon righteousness that exalts a nation, as opposed to individual retribution. There is an emphasis upon the temple, much more so than in Samuel and Kings. The worship that goes on in the temple. It's the book of Chronicles that tells us about the change of heart of Manasseh. This is not found in the book of Kings, where he's taken to Assyria. There he has a conversion experience. He comes back and he is put on his throne once again. We have two individuals who play a prominent role in the post-exilic period outside of the prophets, and those are Ezra and Nehemiah. The first concern of the exiles when they returned was the rebuilding of the temple. The foundation was laid, as we saw, in 538. Nothing was done until 520, when Haggai came along and began prophesying, and he encouraged the rebuilding. If If they returned in 538, it's almost 80 years before Ezra comes on the scene. His date is usually put around 458. And if you think of those who returned as the righteous Jews or the zealots, and what was happening in the country at the time of Ezra, you'll see that they are back to their old format again. They went into exile because they were sinning. And we assume that once they have gone into exile, and they have been there for 70 years, and then God allows them to come back, that they wouldn't have all of this sin again. But it doesn't work that way. About the only sin that is not committed after their return from exile is idolatry. They're fairly clean from that, but there are a lot more things that they're doing that are just as bad as the sin in the earlier history. When Ezra returned, there was a problem with mixed marriages. He had to do something about it. Some of these Jewish men had married Gentile women, and the children weren't even speaking Hebrew. They were speaking Ashdodite or some other dialect. And so Ezra makes a point of correcting this situation. If he doesn't correct it, Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem around 445, which would be 10, 15 years after Ezra, and he finds the same situation prevalent. There are still mixed marriages. Nehemiah is a little bit more forceful than Ezra. What Ezra did was fall on his face and pray for an afternoon. Nehemiah called these men in, and it says that he beat some, and he pulled out their hair, and convinced them that they ought to divorce these foreign women. I don't know which one was more effective. It looks like Nehemiah perhaps was, at least for a time. The emphasis that Ezra gives to the Jews who return is the law. Ezra was sent by the king of Persia to go back and teach the people the law of the land. And that was his official position. Ezra was a representative of the king of Persia. He is the minister of religious affairs for the Persian king. And he has the job of going back and teaching the people to observe the law. We don't know really how much influence Ezra had in the development of the canon. This is the time when these books were collected. It was after the exile. There is a tradition that when Ezra went back, that God appeared to him, gave him a vial with a liquid in it. Ezra drank that, and then in the strength of that liquid, he was able to dictate to 40 scribes for a 40-day period. And he dictated 70 books. The number of books that we have in the Old Testament is not that many. So he dictated all that we have in the Old Testament plus apocryphal books or pseudepigraphical books. But that you'll find in the Apocalypse of Ezra, which is in itself an apocryphal book. It tells the way that Ezra was able to recreate all of these books. Now there may be a kernel of truth in this. See, not that Ezra dictated them all from memory or from inspiration, but that he was the one responsible for gathering them together, at least in a preliminary canon of Scripture. We have Ezra reading the law to the people. In the book of Ezra, it indicates that all the people were brought together and they read the law from sunup until noon. It's in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8. When the 7th month came, and the Israelites had settled in their towns, all the people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate. They told Ezra the scribe to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. So on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, which was made up of men and women, and all who were able to understand. He read it aloud from daybreak till noon, as he faced the square before the water gate in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand. And all the people listened attentively to the book of the law. And it tells us he was on a high platform, the people were down below, but there were also others who helped him. In verse 8, it speaks about some Levites. They read from the book of the law of God, making it clear and giving a meaning so that the people could understand what was being read. Now, we don't know if this is a commentary that he is giving, or that the Levites are giving on the law, or if this is a translation that they are making. So the law was written in Hebrew. Most of the people at this time were speaking Aramaic, so it may be that Ezra read, and then it was translated into the languages that the people could understand. So even at this early time, there had to be help for the people to understand what was written in the law. And there's a bunch of confessions that they also have when the Israelites confessed the sins that they were committing. Other problems that they had to do with the breaking of the law of the Sabbath. Nehemiah has to deal with that. Now, these are the good Jews who have gone back to Canaan, to Palestine. And yet they are breaking the rules just like they had before the exile. They were allowing people to work on the Sabbath. Merchants were coming in from Tyre and other places selling fish on the Sabbath. And so what Nehemiah does is to lock the gate on Friday at sunset. And the gate then is not reopened until Sunday morning. So these people then who come can't get in. And I guess after your fish spoil a time or two, then you decide this is worth the effort. And so they did not come back to try to do their work on the Sabbath. Nehemiah is also the one who is responsible for the rebuilding of the wall of the city of Jerusalem, which is an excellent endeavor on his part, and a good achievement on the part of Nehemiah. During the building of the wall, he encounters other problems. There are destitute Jews among them. Some of them have actually sold members of their family into servitude so that they could make ends meet. And Nehemiah takes care of this. You're not supposed to sell your families for slaves. And he also prevents usury, which was taking place. Now, all of these are sins that the people are committing. This group of returned exiles. And so you have to deal with them same as you did before the exile. We do not have the millennium after the exile. And I think this is one of the frustrations of the people at that time. All of the prophecies of the prophets, that after God had destroyed the nation, He would bring them back, and every man would dwell under his own fig tree, and he would have peace, he would have prosperity, the temple would be restored, there would be worship again, and this didn't happen, at least the way in which they perceived it. So there was a lot of despair. They didn't know what to do. And so we have a situation here that leads us into that type of literature that develops between the Testaments, and that's the apocalyptic literature, which speaks about a divine inbreaking of God into history that's going to set everything right. The second coming of Christ, which will set everything right. Same sort of thing.
Going back to the book, where we are here in the book, looking at what God wants us to do.
Or remember, that's right. They use that as an argument. They use that as an argument to these people who have married foreign women. Say, it's Solomon, as great as he was, couldn't get away with foreign wives. He fell as a result of it. You, who are just a small pipsqueak, see, you're not going to be able to stand either. So it's the argument from the greater to the lesser that Nehemiah and Ezra used. And on Thursday, we will do some reviews and try to prepare you for the final examination. Try to. Try to.